Tools of the philosophical trade. This presentation has to do with informal logic, and I'll explain that term in just a minute. Meanwhile, you want to read the quote from Plato's Republic. Well, this may be a bit of hyperbole, which is itself a rhetorical form of speech. Hyperbole means exaggeration. And obviously, I whipped out the Nazi card on you here. But the point is that in order that we have any kind of mental self-defense against the tools of rhetoric, or the art of persuasion, and ideology, we need to have at least some basic knowledge of logic and how arguments go together and what makes arguments better and worse. At the very least, we need to clarify some of our basic terminology so that we can actually be on the same page and communicate. So logic is, in that sense, a tool that allows us to make sure that we're communicating. And that's why this slide presents a very brief history of three major stages in the concept of the logos, from which we get the word logic. Heraclitus, in the upper left corner there, Heraclitus was the first to use the term logos in the sense of the hidden spiritual meaning or pattern of reality. If you'll remember, Heraclitus is the one who said, you can't step in the same river twice. And by that he meant that reality is constant change. At the same time, it's not random change, because the change is governed by the logos. That is, it's pattern change or meaningful change. So Heraclitus was the first to make, really to thematize the logos, to make a philosophical theme of the logos in the way that he did. In the lower left, you have Philo of Alexandria. He was a Jewish theologian, and as a Jewish theologian, he was a monotheist. He was a believer in a single, perfect, absolute God. And that kind of belief runs into a philosophical problem, which is, if God is absolutely perfect, unchanging unity, how does such a God ever create anything or relate to creation or relate to God's creatures? And Philo answered this by using the idea of the logos, which he found ready to hand, I guess, in the Greek philosophical tradition. He took that idea in order to talk about God's self-expression. So, in the same way that when we talk, the words are our words, but in another sense, they're different from us. They are our expression in the world of whatever's going on inside us. So God also has self-expression, and that is the logos, the Word of God. Now, that phrase, the Word of God, of course, sounds Christian or Trinitarian, but Philo, being Jewish, was not talking about the Word as the second person of a Trinity. That wouldn't be allowed by Jewish theology. He is talking about the Word simply as the self-expression of God, the way in which God reveals to others, I guess you could say, how what is God's own nature. And the quote in Greek is the beginning of the Gospel of St. John. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Again, here the Word is Logos. And in this case, the second person of the Christian Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. So the Logos, the Word of God, is identified with Jesus by Christians. And, of course, this is one of the fundamental beliefs of Christianity. In the first part of this presentation, we're going to have a number of definitions. These will help to answer many of the questions on the 15-point review sheet. There are 2 logic review sheets. One of them is 15 points, and it's a bunch of definitions. If you can't find the definitions in this PowerPoint, you can also look at the Stanford Online Encyclopedia of Philosophy, or the Online Encyclopedia of Philosophy that is out of the University of Tennessee, I think, or the Encyclopedia of Philosophy, which is bound volumes that you'll find in the library, or you could get a logic textbook if it has a glossary or something like that. Also, there is a glossary in your textbook, The Invitation to Philosophy, and if that doesn't work, you might try the index and see what Honer and Hunt tell you about whatever term it is you need to look up. So to begin with, we have a basic definition of logic, though based on the previous slide, I think it's safe to say that logic for the Greeks meant something more than the rules that determine the validity of arguments. For the Greeks, there was a pattern or meaning to reality that is hidden and spiritual. And when we have a true concept of something, the pattern or logos of our mind is in a way matching the logos or pattern of the thing that is being known. And you could sort of liken this to putting a wall plug in a wall socket. You get current, you get electricity, you get energy. And that's somewhat how the Greeks thought of knowledge. A true concept is one in which the logos of the concept matches the logos of the thing. We will be talking about 2 major types of logical arguments, inductive and deductive. Now, the definitions that are given here of inductive and deductive are somewhat abstract, so let me make it more simple. Inductive logic is the logic of deriving conclusions or inferences. The word conclusion and inference, those 2 words are synonyms. Inductive logic is deriving conclusions or inferences from experience. So, for example, if I drove on the highway 2 days ago and it was a parking lot, and I drove on the highway yesterday and it was a parking lot, I might infer that if I drive on the highway today, it will also be a parking lot. Now, as with all conclusions based on experience, that could be right or wrong, depending on how good my evidence for that conclusion is. So again, inductive logic can be strong or weak depending on how much evidence is given. We'll talk more about that in a few minutes. Deductive logic looks only at whether a particular conclusion follows from the premises given. So if, assuming the premises to be the case, does the conclusion actually follow from those premises? Premises, another word for premise, would be argument or proposition in the sense of something that somebody asserts. So in its simplest form, you would have maybe 2 premises and a conclusion. This would be a syllogism. We'll get to syllogisms in a few minutes. But just to give you an example of deductive logic. For example, Socrates is a chicken. Now, I know that's not true, but it doesn't matter whether it's true or false. We're just going to assume it to be true. So Socrates is a chicken. All chickens are yellow. So what is the conclusion? The only conclusion that the premises support is that Socrates is yellow. Because if Socrates is a chicken and all chickens are yellow, Socrates must be yellow. So that is what we're looking at in deductive logic is, does the conclusion follow from the premises we're given, whether or not those premises are true? As I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, we will be talking about informal logic. So just to clarify the distinction between formal and informal logic. Formal logic is primarily symbolic logic. And these sets of symbols that are used by logicians, they look very much like algebra, but as far as I know, they don't have much of a relationship to algebra. So the symbolic systems that different logicians come up with may not even look a lot like one another, and these aren't mathematical. But what they are is an attempt to represent language by symbols. The thought being that if we get rid of some of the rhetorical and grammatical fuzziness of our language, by replacing the language with symbols, we can see the structure of arguments more clearly, and we can think more logically. Informal logic, what we're going to be doing, has to do with, as it says here, testing arguments for validity, but it also has to do with what are called logical fallacies. That is, logical arguments that seem true but might not be true, but might be true. We'll get back to fallacies in a few minutes. It also can deal with rhetoric, ideology, and other things having to do with argumentation. But it does not generally use very much in this way of symbolic logic, though there's no hard and fast line between informal and formal logic. All right, some more basic definitions. The concept, combination of words that convey meaning, and then it says NB means nota bene, means note well. And the point that I'm making there is that the Greeks tended to think of a concept as more of a picture image of something. We tend to think of a concept as a proposition. In other words, a declarative statement. The Greeks' idea of concept, as I said, is more of a picture image, and therefore, like any good picture image, the concept has to stay the same, not change, not move, not be blurry. It has to be clear and well lit. And so, the Greeks thought of concepts in a kind of picture image way. Reason to put together concepts in a coherent way. Now, reflection, Hunter, your textbook doesn't go into this, but I think it's good to distinguish two types of reflection. First, rigorous and logical reflection, where we're examining our ideas, we're organizing our ideas, sort of like the thinking you might do before you wrote an essay. You think about the questions, think about how to lay out your answers, how to present things in a logical and systematic way. That kind of reflection, that's one kind of reflection. The other kind is meditative or contemplative. Meditative reflection is where you just look at your ideas without the purpose of clarifying them or critiquing them or anything like that. You just hold an idea in your mind. Contemplation is a type of reflection in which one just remains silent, quiet within oneself, perhaps through prayer and meditation. So those are more spiritual forms of reflection, as opposed to the more systematic forms of reflection. Intuition is a term that, in its common usage, is not a philosophical term. In modern philosophy, that is the philosophy that starts with Descartes and goes through about Kant, in modern philosophy, intuition just means sense perception or sense input. In fact, I think a pretty good synonym for intuition in modern philosophy is just input, as long as we remember that input is a much newer word, 20th century word. So I've given you a definition of sign here, but basically anything that has a meaning is a sign. Symbols, however, I would distinguish from signs because while a sign is arbitrary, that means a sign doesn't have to be doesn't have to look the way it looks, or doesn't have to mean what it means. It could be changed and really nobody'd get hurt. On the other hand, symbols are more meaningful, more imbued with meaning. In fact, the word symbol means that the symbol carries with it some of the reality of the thing signified. And so you don't change symbols willy-nilly. And when symbols do get changed, it often creates controversy and conflict. For example, if you tried to change how many stripes or stars there are on the American flag, you'd probably get quite a fight. On the other hand, if you tried to uh, change the shape or color of a stop sign, probably people wouldn't really mind all that much. They would get, at the very least, they'd get used to it. We wouldn't have to have, a big battle over it. So signs are less uh, burdened with meaning, let's say. The basic element of logic that we'll be looking at are statements or propositions. As it says here, a sentence that is either true or false. But the structure of a proposition is important to know. The basic structure is you have a subject and a predicate. The subject is the subject, or generally speaking, the noun in the sentence. The predicate is something that modifies the noun. So they are connected by the copula, some form of the verb to be. So the basic form of a statement or proposition is X is Y. So the boy is running. That would be a declarative statement or proposition. In that case, boy is the subject and running is the predicate that modifies the subject. We're saying what we're doing essentially in a statement or proposition is placing the subject in the category of the predicate. So we are placing the boy in the category of running things. Now you might say there are sentences that don't have the verb to be in it. A simple example would be the boy runs. But in cases like that, the verb to be is just hidden. So really the boy runs means the boy is running. So the verb is there. You have to have some form of the verb to be for a sentence to be meaningful. In order to have an argument, you have to have at least two propositions because one has to provide support for the other. In other words, you have to have at least one premise and a conclusion. And the conclusion is based on the premise or premises. An assertion is not an argument. An assertion is where we say, we just make a claim without giving any reasons for it. It is only an argument when we give reasons for the claim that we're making. This is a list of things that make arguments stronger. That's a way of telling whether an argument is relatively strong or weak. Simply does the argument hang together? Are there bias and presuppositions? Are there contradictions? Is the argument consistent with what we already know to be the case? These are all ways of, if we ask ourselves these questions, we can determine whether an argument is strong or weak. Now, Occam's razor is another way of assessing arguments. And this goes back to a late medieval Roman Catholic theologian and philosopher named William of Occam. And Occam's razor, one statement of Occam's razor is, don't multiply premises unnecessarily. Don't multiply premises unnecessarily. In other words, don't give more reasons for your conclusion than you have to. Why not? Because if you give, the more reasons you give, the more chance there is that you will have contradictions between your premises. If you pile on a whole bunch of reasons for your conclusion, you might seem desperate. Imagine that you are a person who has just gotten their driver's license and you are trying to convince the parents to let you use the family car on a Saturday night. So what you want to do is you want to give arguments that are concise and relevant to that conclusion. The conclusion you want your parents to reach is that you should be allowed to use the car. So you say things like, I've done all my chores, I've got all my homework done, I'm only going to be hanging out with Bob and George and they're good people, none of us drink or do drugs or anything like that, I'll be home at 10. Those are all relevant reasons. But if you just keep going and laying it on, what are your parents going to think? You know, as you pile on more and more reasons, you seem desperate, you seem like you're hiding something. Um, and so Occam's razor says, don't do that. Give as few reasons as possible and the best ones. And if you have one argument with 4 premises and one argument with 2 premises, but they come to the same conclusion, then the argument with 2 premises is more elegant, as the scientists would say. It is a stronger argument because it gets the same conclusion with less mess, if you want to put it. Now let's talk a bit more about inductive logic. Again, inductive logic, drawing conclusions from evidence or experience. And therefore, inductive arguments cannot be valid or invalid, which only applies to deductive logic. Inductive arguments can only be strong or weak, depending on how good the evidence or experience is. So, to be technical, even though you can arrange an inductive argument in the form of a syllogism, it's not technically a syllogism because it's not deductive. By the way, if you are a Sherlock Holmes fan, you will probably know that Sherlock Holmes, the great detective, claims always to be doing the science of deduction. I think the fact of the matter is, of course, as a detective, all of the conclusions that Sherlock Holmes comes to are based on evidence, and therefore they're actually inductive logic. So I think what the case was is that 100 years ago, when Arthur Conan Doyle was writing the Sherlock Holmes stories, these terms may have meant slightly different things, or exactly opposite things in this case. But obviously what Sherlock Holmes was doing was making specific observations, generalizing from those observations, and deriving a conclusion, and that's inductive logic. Here are some of the common forms of inductive logic. We're not going to go over Hume on analogy right now. We'll probably come back to that a little bit later when we do some philosophy of religion. You don't need to necessarily know all of these types of induction. This is just more for information. And here's a nice example of inductive logic from The Bear of Very Small Brains, Winnie the Pooh. By the way, if you haven't read Winnie the Pooh, A.A. Milne's writings are wonderful. He has books of poetry that are absolutely delightful books. They're aimed at children, but they're fun books. While you don't need to know the different types of inductive argument, this is a question on the review sheet, the criteria for reliable induction. In other words, if you wanted to make your inductive logic stronger so that your conclusions were more certain, stronger, then what could you do? Well, you could get more evidence. You could get more reliable evidence. You could get more relevant evidence. You can take into account counter instances and alternative theories. All of these things would help to support your conclusion if you take them into account. All right, a little bit about deductive reasoning. Here again, the basic principle of deductive logic is we're not concerned initially with the truth or falsity of the statements, but only does the conclusion follow from the premises that were given. If it does, and it's the only conclusion that can come from those premises, it's a necessary conclusion. So again, inference means both a conclusion and the process of deriving a conclusion from premises. However, the terms imply and infer are very often misused. So let me give you a simple way of knowing the difference between the two terms. If I imply something, you can infer what I'm implying. If you imply something, I can infer what you're implying. But no one can infer something to somebody else. It doesn't work like that. So basically what you have in a deductive argument is you have premises. The premises imply something. The conclusion derives the inference from those premises that is being implied. Now, one other term on here that is not particularly important, but it is on the review sheet, is analytic argument, one in which the conclusion contains nothing not contained in the premises. The best example of that is a definition. The word and the definition of the word mean the same thing. Not a hugely important point, but it is a concept that comes up in the history of philosophy. Here are some types of deductive logic. Again, you don't necessarily need to know these. The only one that I think is on the review sheet is a hypothetical syllogism, which hypothetical syllogisms are just like regular syllogisms, but they use if-then statements. If Socrates is a chicken, and if all chickens are yellow, then Socrates is yellow. So otherwise, I think it's interesting to point out that mathematical equations are examples of deductive logic. If you understand the premises, 1, the plus sign, and the equal sign, then the only conclusion you can come to is that 1 plus 1 equals 2. So that's deductive logic as well. So a categorical syllogism consists of 3 categorical propositions. Categorical here is a kind of a complicated term because it can mean a couple of different things. The simplest way of putting it is that categorical means sort of the opposite, or, well, yeah, the opposite of a hypothetical proposition. A categorical proposition, we might say, is not hypothetical. A hypothetical proposition would be an if-then statement. A categorical proposition is stated categorically. It's stated with no qualification, let's say. So, as we've said, in a categorical proposition, you have a subject and a predicate, and we are relating one class of things, the subject, to another class of things, the predicate. And a hypothetical syllogism, again, just adds if-then statements. So it is not categorical. So here are some examples of deductive syllogisms. This is a valid deductive syllogism. In this case, all of the premises and conclusion happen to be true, but whether they're true or not, again, we assume the premises to be true in order to see if the conclusion follows from the premises that were given. Another thing we can do to try to see the form of the syllogism is replace the basic terms in the syllogism with letters. So all A or B, some A or C, therefore some C or B. Another thing we can do to see the form, whether the argument works, whether it's valid, is we can use a Venn diagram. Now my Venn diagrams, I have become aware since I made this PowerPoint, are not all that accurate, but nevertheless, we can see that in the argument given on the previous slide, all the argument is claiming is that some bosons are subatomic microscopic particles. Now, it is actually a fact that all bosons are subatomic microscopic particles, but the argument doesn't claim that. It only claims that some of them are. Here's a more tricky syllogism. It seems right until you start to analyze it. All mammals are mortal. All dogs are mortal. All dogs are mammals. All of the statements are true. What could possibly be wrong? You see the form of there, all A are B, all C are B, therefore all C are A. But we can get a hint of what's wrong if we replace dogs with snakes. Then it would read, all mammals are mortal, all snakes are mortal. Still a true statement. Therefore, all snakes are mammals. So that indicates that this is an invalid syllogism. And when we look at the Venn diagram in the next slide, I think you'll see why. So, so while the previous argument told us that dogs are mortals and mammals are mortals, it did not tell us that dogs are mammals. And therefore, it is an invalid argument. Here we have an example of a valid deductive syllogism in which all the statements are untrue. Slightly different than the version I gave earlier. Here Socrates is a chicken, all chickens are green, therefore Socrates is green. So even though you have false premises and a false conclusion, it's valid because that conclusion follows from the premises we're given, as we'll see in the Venn diagram. Here you can see that Socrates clearly belongs to the class of green chickens, as you probably all knew. Now let's look at some fallacies. Again, a fallacy is an argument that might be true, but it might not be true, but it might be true. The problem being, you don't have enough information to decide whether it's true or not. So the first is the argumentum or reductio ad absurdum. We've actually had one or two examples of this already this semester. For example, in the case of, in the first book of the Republic, where Socrates is dealing with a definition of justice that he wants to disprove. The definition is that justice is paying one's debts. And Socrates gives his example of the knife, that what if you had a friend who lent you a knife, and while you were in possession of his knife, he went insane. Now he comes to you asking for his knife back. Justice is to pay one's debts, then you've got to give him the knife. But that can't be just to give a knife to a deranged person. Therefore, that definition can't be right. Now, the problem is, it may be the case that in every other instance in which a person owes a debt, it would be just to pay that debt, except in this one case. So what Socrates has done rhetorically is he has found one case in which the definition doesn't work, and he has suggested that therefore that definition of justice never works. So another example of the same type of thing would be in Zeno's paradox, a paradox of motion that we talked about. Zeno of Elea was the follower of Parmenides who came up with various examples of the paradoxes that result from believing in things like change and motion, etc. And so he was the guy who said, you know, if you walk to the wall, you have to first walk halfway to the wall, and to walk halfway to the wall, you have to walk a quarter of the way, and an eighth of the way, and a 16th of the way, etc. So that ultimately, in order to move, you would have to go through an infinite number of points in a finite amount of time, and that's impossible. That's an absurd consequence of believing in motion. So here again, you take your opponent's argument, you show that it has an absurd consequence, and that's the whole argument. So obviously, you know, it's a bit sketchy. The dilemma, or more precisely, the false dilemma, is to say that a situation is an either-or situation. And it implies, like some of the fallacies do, that you need to decide, that there is some pressure to decide one way or the other. For example, in the examples I've given, you're either for capital punishment or for mass murder. Now, obviously, those are not exhaustive categories. There are other positions you could take that might relate capital punishment and mass murder in different ways. So these aren't the only two conclusions that you can come to, but the argument suggests that you don't have any other option and that you need to choose. The sophist and his pupil is a dilemma that goes back to ancient times, and it's called the paradox of the court. And I'm just going to read it to you from Wikipedia so that I don't mess it up horribly. It is also known as the counter dilemma of Euathlus. It is said that the famous sophist Protagoras took on a pupil, Euathlus, on the understanding that the student pay Protagoras for his instruction after he wins his first court case. After instruction, Euathlus decided not to enter the profession of law, and Protagoras decided to sue Euathlus for the amount owed. Protagoras argued that if he won the case, he would be paid his money. If Euathlus won the case, Protagoras would still be paid according to the original contract, because Euathlus would have won his first case. Euathlus, however, claimed that if he won, then by the court's decision he would not have to pay Protagoras. If, on the other hand, Protagoras won, then Euathlus would still not have won a case and would therefore not be obliged to pay. The question is, which of the two men is in the right? And if you want to know the answer to that, you can go to Wikipedia, or better, you might go to Stanford Online Encyclopedia of Philosophy and find. The appeal to authority is, as you see from the form down there in the bottom left corner, very simple. A asserts B, therefore B, because A is held to be an authority. For example, the president said Americans do not torture. Well, the president should know about that. He should be an authority on that subject. Therefore, Americans do not torture. It raises the question of the difference between valid authority and authoritarianism. And what is notable, however, is that in terms of argumentative form, even if the authority cited is an actual authority, as in this case, that doesn't make the argument valid. The form of the argument is rhetorical, not deductive. The ad hominem argument attacks the person rather than their argument. So here I've given you a neat little kind of a syllogism, I guess, but Heidegger defined authenticity as a resolute orientation toward being. That's true. He did, in fact, define authenticity in that way. However, Heidegger was a Nazi, and therefore probably his definition of inauthenticity disguises Nazi tendencies. I actually know people who have made arguments somewhat like this, and it really raises the question of whether and to what extent a person's, how do you want to put it, bad choices and maybe bad character influence the quality of their intellectual output. Now, Heidegger was a Nazi. Does fascism inform Heidegger's philosophy? If Heidegger's philosophy is informed by Nazism, then should we read him at all? If we are going to read him, and we know there is going to be some, fascistic elements in his philosophy, how do we recognize those and weed those out? Do we even have agreement about what those would be? So this raises all kinds of questions, not just for Heidegger, but really for any philosopher who, may have not been, The post hoc fallacy is the fallacy of bad science. It is attributing, as it says, causal agency to a preceding event. In other words, the form of this argument is B follows A, therefore A caused B. Could be true. Again, we don't have enough information. A famous example of this, the great scientist Linus Pauling was diagnosed with cancer, and he decided to doctor himself by getting a house on the beach, renting a whole bunch of videotapes of comedies, and taking mega doses of vitamin C. And he would watch comedies and laugh and laugh and laugh because he thought that was good for him. And he would take mega doses of vitamin C, and lo and behold, his cancer went into remission. So he became convinced that mega doses of vitamin C cure everything. And now, of course, it could be the case that that was what happened. Or it could have been the laughing that did it. Or it could have been it just went into remission spontaneously. That sometimes happens. So, to draw the conclusion based on his own personal experience that megadoses of vitamin C would cure cancer is just bad science. By the way, if you do take mega doses of vitamin C, uh, your body will just flush the excess out. It really won't do you any harm or good. On the other hand, you won't get scurvy. The straw man argument. What you do in this argument is you take your opponent's argument, you insert you present that argument in its weakest form so that you can beat the stuffing out of it. So, for example, now on this, I'd like to modify the slide a little bit. Instead of saying communist, let's say Marxist. Marxists are communists, but not all communists are Marxists. Not all communists are followers of Marx. Keep in mind that the word communism is a very complex word, but in its basic meaning, it just means people who live in communes. So they don't have to be Marxists. They could be Marxists, but the reason I want to change that communist to Marxist here is that because communist is too broad, and not all communists would be materialists, but most Marxists are materialists, so it works a little bit better. So Marxists believe that everything is explainable in material terms. That is true. They are philosophical materialists. They believe everything's made of matter, and therefore they cannot account for consciousness. This is the the weakening of the argument by the opponent. They have, in a way, they have turned the argument in a direction that weakens it by saying that because communists are Marxists are materialists, therefore they can't account for consciousness. In fact, they do account for consciousness. They think that consciousness is an epiphenomenon of brain activity. An epiphenomenon is a phenomenon that doesn't exist in and of itself, but it results from something else, like heat results from boiling water. So in that sense, consciousness, according to a materialist, would be like the steam that comes off the boiling water in relationship to the brain. So they do have an account of consciousness. So the opponent here has presented the argument in a weak form, almost an absurd form, and therefore they can conclude whatever they want. In this case, Marxists don't believe in conscious thought, which is, absurd. So actually, this argument may be more of a straw man in service of a reductio ad absurdum. And that brings up a very good point to keep in mind, which is that logical fallacies are not always easy to tell apart from one another, and often are mixed together. So actually picking out a logical fallacy is sometimes not all that clear. The red herring is similar to the straw man in that it diverts our attention away from the main argument by introducing a false premise. And the name red herring comes from probably a 18th century philosopher who was training hunting dogs, and in order to confuse them, in order to make them into better hunting dogs so that they wouldn't get easily confused when the hunt was actually on, he took a bag of red herrings and dragged it along the path where the rabbit had run. And then when the dogs came across that herring smell, which is very pungent, they couldn't follow the rabbit anymore. They would get confused. And he had to train them how to overcome that confusion. In this way, it was a distraction, and that idea of using herring or red herring became the name of the logical fallacy. Now, here we have an example of a red herring. Proponents of women's choice argue that a woman should have rights to make decisions for her own body. That is, in fact, true. That is what women's choice proponents do, in fact, argue. But bodies cannot be subjects of conscious choice. Now, I don't know where this premise comes from. I don't know what it means, but it diverts our attention away from the first statement. And then you can conclude sort of anything you want. Therefore, proponents of women's choice are opposed to the body, which is, of course, the opposite of the case. So really using something like a straw man or a red herring, you can really get about any conclusion you want from about any argument. The slippery slope is probably the favorite logical fallacy of the politician. The basic form of it is something like A leads to B, B leads to C, C leads to D, D leads to Armageddon. So, I mean, there's a threat implied in most slippery slope arguments. Also, this is slippery slope is the basis of a kind of reasoning called catastrophic thinking. And I have given you an example here. You know, you fail the test, then you'll fail the class, and then if you fail the class, you'll be put on academic suspension, and you won't get your loans and grants, and you'll become a homeless bag person, right? So now this, I mean, it sounds funny, but this is actually a serious and debilitating way of thinking. And if you find yourself, especially around finals time, thinking in these terms, what you have to do is stop yourself and realize that the basic problem of a slippery slope is that no one of the steps in the slippery slope are necessary. For example, it could be the case that you might fail a test. But even if you do fail the test, does that mean you're going to fail the class? No, of course not. If you fail a test, what should you do about it? Maybe you should talk to the professor about it. Maybe there are other things you could do. Maybe it won't affect your grade in such a negative way that you fail the class. There are a lot of possibilities. But our brains tend, when we're not actively focusing and controlling our brains, they tend to dwell on the negative. And this is one example of that. Another example might be, you know, if the United States doesn't pay down its national debt, then our creditors will come collecting, and then the United States will become a third world country and catastrophe. So that's the, you know, again, we would have to look at each one of those connections, the connections between those statements, in order to know whether the slippery slope made any sense or not. The ad populum fallacy, I like to call this, but mom, all the kids are doing this or wearing that, and to which your mom or dad or someone, great logicians that parents are, said, if all the kids were jumping off a cliff, would you want to jump too? Of course, you being you know, a subtle logician in your youth, maybe then responded, if it would get me away from you, mom, something like that, right? But my point being that the ad populum fallacy is a peer pressure fallacy. For example, all good liberals believe in trade unions, which implies that if you don't believe in trade unions, you're not a good liberal. There's something wrong with you. All good conservatives believe in small government, which suggests if you don't believe in small government, you're not a good conservative. Therefore, there's something wrong with you. And there's sometimes an implied threat that if you don't believe or do such and such, bad things will happen to you. So this is a very a fallacy that you see very often in advertisements, where they are trying to use peer pressure, in fact, shaming tactics, in order to get the consumer to buy their product. Good examples of this would be basically any kind of hygienic anything that they're trying to sell you, from toothpaste to hair color to whatever. They try to make you feel like if you don't have this product, there's going, you know, people will shun you. And because nobody wants to be shunned, everybody wants to be popular. Therefore, they are implying that if you don't use this product, you know, you won't be popular. The petitio principii, begging the question, this is taking a premise as a conclusion. So, for example, illegal immigrants should not be allowed any legal status because illegal immigration is wrong. But the fact, or the assertion that illegal immigration is wrong is actually a premise that needs to be proved before we can conclude that illegal immigrants should not be allowed any legal status. So basically, it's an inverted argument where you just assume what needs to be proved. There are many other forms of rhetorical speech or deceptive speech, we might call it. For example, vaguing it up, simply making one's terms so vague that it is hard to recognize the logical connection of the propositions. Ambiguousness is another way of doing that, using the same term or concept in multiple ways, or at least two different ways. Amphibole is a specific kind of ambiguousness. Probably the most famous version of an amphibole is Groucho Marx joke, where he says, "Last night I caught a prowler in my pajamas. What he was doing in my pajamas, I'll never know." In other words, again, using a phrase in two different ways. One that I saw recently that I thought was fascinating is in one paragraph, an author used a metaphor, and in the next paragraph, the author went on to assume that the metaphor was literal. That was a pretty neat trick. Fallacies of composition and analysis. Fallacy of composition is if you like ice cream and you like pickles, then you'll like pickle ice cream. And then a fallacy of analysis is the opposite. The genetic fallacy is a more literary fallacy. It is to analyze a work of art by reference to the biography of the artist or the historical process of the coming to be of the work of art, rather than the artwork itself. True Scotsman fallacy, a very popular fallacy today. It is an example of it is a true Scotsman wears a kilt. A true Scotsman eats haggis. A true Scotsman speaks with a brogue, which suggests that if you don't wear a kilt, eat haggis, and speak with a brogue, you're not a true Scotsman. How this is used is, for example, if a particular member of a particular religious group commits a terrorist act, then you will hear people say, well, they're not a real whatever member of that religion, right? The rest of the religion is okay, but this person is one outlier that doesn't belong. When in fact that person is part of that religion, and all religions have these kinds of people, unfortunately. The pathetic fallacy is attributing human emotions to things that aren't human, especially nature. The sky is crying, meaning it's raining. That is another literary fallacy. There are hundreds of these fallacies. I would highly recommend that you look up the article on logical fallacies in the Stanford Online Encyclopedia of Philosophy. Also, various people have written books on fallacies. One that's interesting, Jeremy Bentham, the founder of utilitarianism back in the 19th century, wrote a book on political fallacies. And what's interesting is that this book is over 150 years old, and most of these fallacies are still in use. I guess that's not surprising. So for this section, you have two review sheets, a 15.1 that's mainly definitions, and a regular 10.1, so don't forget to do both of them. Take care.